Economic sanctions were built to punish hostile governments without firing a single shot, and for decades, they worked exactly as intended. What nobody expected was that these same sanctions would shatter the global food supply chain, send grocery prices into a death spiral across 3 continents, and trigger a fertilizer crisis timed perfectly to destroy the spring planting season for billions of people who had nothing to do with the conflict. Your bread, your cooking oil, your meat, the price you pay for all of it gets decided not by the farmer who grew it, but by a compliance officer sitting in a bank tower who has never touched soil in his life. The architecture of financial isolation. Credit and short-term financing hold together roughly 80% of all international trade, a flow of capital exceeding $10 trillion every year, and the risk of non-payment across all that activity averages just 0.2%. Which makes trade finance one of the safest asset classes in banking. Sanctions obliterate that safety. When the United States targets a country like Iran, it does not ban food shipments directly, and in almost every modern sanctions regime, agricultural goods, medicine, and medical devices carry explicit exemptions. The weapon is something different entirely, called secondary sanctions. Section 1245 of the National Defense Authorization Act of 2012 handed the U.S. Treasury the power to punish any foreign bank on earth that processes financial transactions with Iran's central bank. And the punishment is that the offending bank loses access to U.S. dollar clearing. For a global bank, that amounts to a death sentence, which meant banks stopped evaluating individual transactions for humanitarian exemptions because that compliance process is slow and expensive, and one mistake exposes the institution to billions in penalties. What they did instead was cut Iran off entirely, a behavior the industry calls de-risking. Between 2011 and 2018, the number of active correspondent banks worldwide fell by 19.3%, and some small island developing states watched their correspondent banking relationships collapse by 48 to 60%. And this is where the paradox takes shape. Food is legally exempt from sanctions, but the banks decided the legal risk outweighed the profit. That calculation got worse in 2019, when the U.S. Treasury designated Iran's central bank as a specially designated global terrorist under Executive Order 13224. Because now, even a routine wheat shipment could trigger counterterrorism liability if any entity in the supply chain had connections to the IRGC. Proof of innocence fell entirely on the processing bank. The Financial Action Task Force piled on in 2020 by blacklisting Iran, mandating extreme enhanced due diligence from every financial institution worldwide, compounding the secondary sanctions risk and making standard correspondent banking with Iran all but impossible. The 5-step chain, from Washington to empty shelves. A regulatory decision made in Washington translates into empty grocery shelves in Tehran, through a precise 5-step chain, and each link makes the next one worse. Compliance risk comes first. Humanitarian exemptions exist on paper, but the entire burden of proving a transaction qualifies falls on the bank, not on the government that wrote the exemption. Bank de-risking follows immediately. When the fees on a single grain trade amount to a few $1,000s, and the penalty for a compliance failure runs into the billions, every bank reaches the same conclusion and severs the relationship entirely. Delayed settlement is the 3rd stage. With formal banking channels gone, Iranian importers fall back on fragmented shadow networks, where payments that should clear in hours stretch into weeks, because compliance software at intermediary banks constantly flags the layered corporate structures and freezes transactions for manual review. Shipment disruption hits next. Standard practice across the industry requires full payment confirmation before a vessel can dock, and when funds sit trapped in compliance limbo, bulk carriers loaded with perishable agricultural goods anchor outside Iranian waters with nowhere to go. Fleets numbering up to 40 bulk carriers, hauling over 1 million tons of soy, corn, and wheat, have sat idle in the Persian Gulf for months at a time, racking up demurrage charges between $15,000 and $65,000 per vessel per day. A single delayed grain cargo can accumulate millions in pure penalty costs over a 2-month wait. All of those accumulated costs pile into the final stage. Shadow banking premiums, inflated insurance rates, and demurrage penalties get baked directly into the retail price of food. And the result is a violent upward spiral in what ordinary consumers pay at the store. The Iran hyperinflation catastrophe. By early 2026, this chain reaction had produced one of the worst food crises in modern Iranian history. Official data from the Statistical Center of Iran placed point-to-point inflation at 68.1% by February 2026, levels the country had not experienced since the Anglo-Soviet invasion during World War II. Food prices climbed even faster, with year-over-year food inflation reaching 90%, and the standard consumer food basket rose by 110%. Bread and cereals surged 142%, meat jumped 117%, and cooking oil exploded by 207% on official indices, with free market prices climbing far higher still. A structural failure in the government's foreign exchange system drove much of this collapse. For years, Iran's central bank allocated hard currency at a subsidized rate of 285,000 rials per dollar for basic goods imports. But the open market rate had plunged past 1.32 million and eventually reached 1.47 million rials per dollar. That gap between official and market exchange rates spawns state-level corruption on an industrial scale, because government entities imported goods like Pakistani rice at the cheap rate and then distributed them domestically at prices reflecting the 1.4 million rial free market rate, capturing an arbitrage profit instead of stabilizing consumer prices. January 2026 brought an abrupt end to the subsidized allocation for importers, when the administration replaced it with a direct consumer subsidy of roughly $7 per month per citizen. Overnight, domestic food supply chains absorbed the full impact of the collapsed rial, and dairy, bread, and meat prices spiked within days. Wage growth hovered at a maximum of 45% and failed entirely to keep pace, which explains how per capita meat consumption in Iran plunged from 12 kilograms annually in 2011 to a mere 700 grams by 2026. And the infrastructure told the same story. Iran's main grain terminal at Bandar Imam Khomeini docked only a single cargo ship on an average day, while regional competitors like the UAE's Jebel Ali handled nearly 200 times the volume. The shadow banking empire, $9 billion. That is the amount of illicit financial activity FinCEN identified flowing through U.S. correspondent accounts via front companies in 2024 alone. And that money represents the machinery Iran uses to import food when the formal banking system refuses to cooperate. The architecture runs on two types of entities working in concert: domestic exchange houses called sarafis, and entrusted corporate fronts known as rabar companies. Sanctioned banks like Bank Melli and Shar Bank established these rabar companies to manage international payments, with HMS Trading FZE registered in the UAE on behalf of Shar Bank serving as a prominent example. The mechanics work like this. An Iranian importer pays the Sarafi in rials, and the Sarafi routes payment through an offshore shell company in the UAE, Hong Kong, or Turkey to pay the global grain supplier in hard currency. Funding for those offshore accounts comes from illicit sales of Iranian crude oil to East Asian refiners, transported by a shadow fleet of tankers that engage in dark activity and ship-to-ship transfers to obscure the cargo's origin. Clearing those payments through the international system requires trade-based money laundering, specifically forged bills of lading, falsified beneficial ownership data, and mismatched invoicing designed to confuse compliance screening software. Iran recognized the fragility of this model and began building digital alternatives. Project mBridge, a wholesale central bank digital currency platform built with BRICS nations, processed cumulative transaction volumes surpassing $55.49 billion by early 2026, with the Chinese digital yuan accounting for 95% of all settlements, and none of it touched a Western correspondent bank. The global spillover, the fertilizer shock. February 2026 changed the equation entirely, when direct military conflict erupted between the United States, Israel, and Iran, turning what had been a sanctions-driven trade disruption into an immediate global crisis. Iran's Revolutionary Guard choked off the Strait of Hormuz within days, and vessel traffic through the waterway fell by over 70%. Three of the world's largest maritime insurers, Guard, Skuld, and North Standard, canceled war risk coverage for the entire Persian Gulf region, and container lines, including Hapag-Lloyd, Maersk, and CMA-CGM, suspended all transits through the Red Sea and the Strait. Oil drew the initial headlines because 20% of global crude supply traverses that waterway. But what received less attention was the devastating fertilizer supply shock unfolding simultaneously. Modern agriculture depends on synthetic nitrogen fertilizers, specifically urea and ammonia, both produced using natural gas as the primary feedstock. And the Persian Gulf sits at the center of global fertilizer production because of its abundant, cheap gas reserves. Between 30 and 50% of all globally traded urea exports originate from Qatar, Saudi Arabia, and the UAE, nations sitting west of the strait with no alternative shipping route. Iran ranks as the world's fourth largest urea exporter. That same region supplies 45% of globally traded sulfur, a key input for phosphate fertilizers. Prices responded within days. Egyptian urea surged over 25%, climbing from $485 to more than $625 per metric ton. At the port of New Orleans, urea spiked from $475 to $550 per ton in a single weekend. Fertilizer price indices eclipsed $810 per short ton across the board. The timing could not have been worse. Northern Hemisphere farmers were entering spring planting season, and fossil gas represents 60 to 80% of nitrogen fertilizer production costs. Given that roughly half of all global food production depends on synthetic nitrogen, agricultural economists warned of reduced crop yields and a severe secondary wave of food price inflation hitting in late 2026 and carrying into 2027. Who actually profits from this crisis? Sanctions do not just destroy economic value. They move it violently from one set of hands to another, and tracing where the money lands reveals a pattern that repeats across every major sanctions episode. The largest winners are four companies most people have never heard of: ADM, Bunge, Cargill, and Louis Dreyfus, collectively known as the ABCD commodity traders, who control between 75 and 90% of the global grain trade. During 2022 and 2023, when Russia sanctions disrupted global food flows, the commodity trading industry recorded $100 billion in gross trading margins, a figure without precedent in the sector's history. Retained earnings across these firms accumulated to an estimated $70 to $120 billion over 5 years, enough capital to transform them from market brokers into structural investors reshaping entire supply chains. Major banks profit through a mechanism they publicly complain about. De-risking drives smaller regional competitors out of the market, and the remaining Tier 1 institutions widen their margins and raise fees with no competitive pressure to stop them. Shadow fleet operators collect premiums most legitimate shippers would find staggering. Freight rates on sanctioned cargoes traded at a 202% premium over baseline routes, and the sanctions premium on shipping can reach 60% of total freight costs, which translates to as much as $9.7 million in extra profit per voyage for tanker owners willing to operate in the gray zone. The losses concentrate at both ends of the chain. SME exporters face rejection rates of 50% on trade finance applications, and not because their credit is bad, but because the fixed cost of compliance makes their low-value transactions unprofitable for banks to process. Default rates among small and medium enterprises actually fell from 14 to 10% during this period, yet rejection rates soared from 21 to 50%, proving the barrier is compliance cost, not creditworthiness. Consumers absorb the final blow. Across targeted nations, sanctions raise real food prices by an average of 1.24 percentage points, and the prevalence of undernourishment climbs by 2.1 percentage points. The attempted solutions and why they failed. Every major attempt to solve this problem has fallen short, and each failure reveals a different structural limitation. France, Germany, and the UK created Instex in 2019, a barter clearinghouse designed to match European food and medicine exports with Iranian imports without cross-border currency transfers. Two fatal flaws killed it: a severe imbalance between what Europe exported and what Iran could send back, combined with Iran's refusal to meet FATF transparency standards. Instex processed exactly one medical transaction before being liquidated in March 2023. The Swiss humanitarian trade arrangement took a different approach and secured explicit consent from the U.S. Treasury, which meant participating banks faced no secondary sanctions risk. But the compliance requirements were so exhaustive that the mechanism proved entirely impractical for high-volume, low-margin bulk grain trade. After its pilot transaction, a cancer drug shipment by Novartis, the SHTA processed no additional sales, making it a boutique channel for sensitive pharmaceuticals, and nothing resembling a system capable of feeding 80 million people. The Black Sea Grain Initiative came closest to working at scale. Brokered by the UN and Turkey in 2022 to allow Ukrainian grain exports during the Russian invasion, it placed a joint coordination center in Istanbul, where inspectors physically examined every vessel. The results were real. Wheat prices dropped by 7.9%, and the initiative offset $21.48 billion in economic costs from the war. None of that mattered, because the mechanism depended on Russian cooperation. And when Russia suspended participation in July 2023, the entire system collapsed overnight. What this means for your grocery bill. Gravity models built by agricultural economists put hard numbers on what sanctions actually cost. Complete trade sanctions reduce agricultural trade by 67 to 73%, functioning as an invisible tariff of 25 to 38.8%. Even partial sanctions that explicitly carve out food still cause agricultural trade to decline by 9.5 to 18%, because the friction lives in the banking system, not in the legal text. When trade costs on final goods rise by 10 percentage points, consumer price inflation climbs by 0.5 percentage points in the first year. That same cost increase applied to intermediate inputs like fertilizer generates a 0.3 percentage point inflation bump that persists much longer because it degrades production efficiency at the farm level. Combined, a simultaneous shock to both channels produces a 0.8 percentage point rise in headline inflation that takes years to work through an economy. The global trade finance gap, meaning the difference between what exporters need and what banks actually provide, now stands at $2.5 trillion. Compliance costs alone exceed $60 billion per year in the United States, and in the UK, financial services spend £38.3 billion annually on compliance, a figure roughly equal to the entire GDP of Estonia. UK banks spend £21,400 every single hour fighting financial crime. None of these costs are shrinking. Alternative payment systems like China's CIPS, Russia's SPFS, and central bank digital currency platforms like mBridge are drawing hard new borders through global finance, and every new border adds a new layer of compliance cost on both sides. Here is the central paradox of this entire story. The law says food is exempt from sanctions. The banking system says it does not care. Once you weaponize access to the US dollar clearing system and then label the central bank of a target country a terrorist entity, legal exemptions on paper cannot overcome the risk calculations of global finance. Grain sits in ships offshore. Fertilizer prices spike at the worst possible moment for planting season. Food inflation hits hardest in households that were already struggling, and every one of those costs ripples outward, from Tehran to Cairo to London to New York, because a globalized food system means no country, no consumer, and no grocery bill is truly insulated from the consequences. Until regulators overhaul how humanitarian exemptions are processed, verified, and underwritten in a way that relieves banks of catastrophic liability, the friction strangling food transactions will keep building, and every one of us will pay for it at the grocery store.